You'd think owning a video game studio is one of the best businesses in the world to be in. The product costs nothing to manufacture once it's built. You can sell the same file to 100 million people. Margins on a hit look obscene. A game that costs $60 million to make can pull in $1 billion. That's the pitch, and it's not wrong. It's just missing the part that actually determines whether the studio survives long enough to see that number. Here's the part that gets left out. Before a studio sells a single copy of anything, it has to spend 3 to 7 years paying people who produce zero revenue. No inventory to liquidate if things go wrong, no physical assets to sell off, just payroll, office leases, and software licenses, month after month for the length of an entire university degree, sometimes two, with nothing coming in until the day the game actually ships. And on that one day, the studio finds out all at once whether the bet worked. That's not really a creative business model. It's a capital risk model that happens to produce something creative. And once you see it that way, almost everything's strange about the industry. The sudden layoffs after games that sold millions of copies, the studios that vanish the year after their biggest hit, the ones that get bought by a publisher right when they seem most successful, starts to make a different kind of sense.
Start with the basic arithmetic of building a modern game. A mid-sized studio might run 40 to 150 people. Programmers, artists, designers, writers, audio engineers, quality testers, producers. In the US or Western Europe, fully loaded costs per employee, salary, benefits, office space, software, equipment, commonly land somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 a year per person. Multiply that across a team of 100 people for a 4-year development cycle, and you're already at roughly $60 to $100 million before a single unit is sold. That's before marketing, before platform fees, before the inevitable delays. And delays aren't the exception. They're closer to the rule. A game announced for a 2-year development window frequently takes 3 or 4. Every extra year isn't just a scheduling inconvenience. It's another $20, $30, $40 million of payroll with zero revenue offsetting it. The team doesn't get smaller while the game is being polished. It often gets bigger because publishers push to add content, chase a competitor's feature, or hit a holiday release window that keeps slipping.
This is the part that separates game studios from most other businesses you can point to. A restaurant that's struggling can shrink its menu, cut staff, and survive on reduced revenue while it figures things out. A software company selling subscriptions gets a trickle of income every month it can react to. A game studio, for most of its life, has no revenue dial to turn. It has one release date, sometimes a launch week spike, and then whatever the sales numbers say. There's no partial credit for a game that's 70% finished. That single fact, zero revenue for years, followed by one enormous, irreversible test, is the hidden engine behind almost every strange thing that happens in this industry.
Here's something that surprises people who assume game studios answer to players. For most studios, the player isn't actually the customer that decides whether the company survives. The publisher is. A publisher, think of companies like Electronic Arts, Take-Two, or Embracer, functions less like a distributor and more like a bank that also happens to run marketing and store relationships. They front the development budget in exchange for a share of revenue, ownership of the intellectual property, or both. For a studio without its own capital, that relationship is often the only thing standing between them and running out of money mid-project. That changes what the studio is actually optimizing for. A game can be beloved by the small community that plays a demo, get glowing previews, and still get canceled. Not because players rejected it, but because the publisher's internal financial model says it won't hit the sales targets needed to justify the marketing spend. The visible product, the game itself, is downstream of a financial decision made in a spreadsheet the players never see. The thing being sold to the public is the game. The thing being sold to keep the lights on is a projection. This is also why so many studios that look creatively successful still end up acquired. Getting bought by a publisher looks like validation, and often the studio's founders genuinely believe it is. But financially, it's frequently the studio trading away its independence for the one thing an indie developer structurally lacks, a cushion big enough to survive the years-long gap between spending and revenue. The acquisition isn't always a reward for success. It's frequently the price of being allowed to keep making games at all.
Now here's the part that reverses almost everyone's intuition. The biggest danger to a game studio usually isn't its worst game, it's its best one. When a studio releases a hit, a game that sells far beyond expectations, the natural response from everyone around that studio is to scale up. Publishers want a bigger sequel. Investors want faster growth. The studio itself, flush with new revenue and new confidence, hires aggressively, rents bigger offices, and greenlights an ambitious follow-up designed to be even more impressive than the game that made them famous. That sounds like a success story. It's actually the moment the studio's risk profile gets worse, not better. A team that made a hit with 60 people at a $30 million budget doesn't stay that size. It often doubles or triples for the next project because a bigger, more expensive game is assumed to be the way to top the last one. But a bigger team burns money faster. A more ambitious scope takes longer to finish. And crucially, a bigger budget means the next game needs to sell far more copies just to break even, let alone turn a profit. Often 2, 3, or 4 times what the original hit sold, because the cost base has grown by that same multiple. So the studio isn't just betting that its next game will be good. It's betting that its next game will be dramatically more commercially successful than the one that already made it famous, while carrying a payroll and burn rate that leaves almost no room for the game to merely do okay. Doing okay used to be survivable. After scaling up, doing okay is often functionally the same as failing. This is the mechanism behind a pattern you've probably noticed without naming it. A studio has one massive hit, gets celebrated everywhere, and then 2 or 3 years later disappears. Folded into a publisher, gutted by layoffs, or shut down entirely, sometimes on the back of a game that still sold a respectable number of copies. Respectable isn't the bar anymore. The bar moved the moment the studio scaled up to chase its own success. There's one story that lays out almost every piece of this mechanism in a single, well-documented collapse. 38 Studios, the company founded by former Boston Red Sox pitcher Curt Schilling. Schilling started the studio in 2006, initially under the name Green Monster Games, funding it largely out of his own baseball earnings because he wanted to build the kind of massive multiplayer online game he loved playing. By 2007, it had been renamed 38 Studios, after his old uniform number. The ambition was enormous from the start. Not a modest first project, but a full MMO, the genre that requires the most sustained capital of any category in gaming because it demands years of development and then years more of live support after launch. In 2010, the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation offered the company a $75 million loan guarantee to relocate from Massachusetts to Providence, betting that hundreds of well-paying creative jobs and tax revenue would follow. It's worth sitting with how unusual that number is. $75 million in state-backed guarantees is the kind of sum governments typically reserve for infrastructure or manufacturing plants, not a video game company that, at the time the guarantee was approved, had not yet shipped a single title. The state was effectively acting as the studio's venture investor, without the diversification a real investor would use to offset the risk of any one bet failing. The studio moved to Providence in April 2011 with around 160 employees, growing toward roughly 400 as it worked on 2 things simultaneously. A single-player role-playing game called Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning, meant to generate near-term revenue, and an ambitious, far more expensive MMO, codenamed Project Copernicus, meant to be the long-term payoff. That MMO was reportedly burning through around $4 million a month even before it was finished, a monthly burn rate roughly equivalent to a mid-sized company's entire annual payroll, spent every 30 days on a product that had not yet earned a cent. Kingdoms of Amalur launched in February 2012. It wasn't a disaster. It sold a respectable number of copies and received mixed to positive reviews. But respectable was never going to be enough because the studio's cost structure had been built around the assumption that both the near-term game and the far larger MMO would succeed simultaneously. One solid single-player release couldn't offset a monthly burn rate that size, especially with the far more expensive project still unfinished and unable to generate any revenue at all. The collapse, once it started, was fast. In May 2012, 38 Studios missed a $1.1 million loan payment to the state. Within weeks, the company laid off its entire staff of around 400 people. Some employees reportedly discovered they hadn't been paid only when the money simply wasn't in their bank accounts, including, according to reporting at the time, an employee who learned her health benefits had been cut off from her own doctor.
In June 2012, the company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, listing under $22 million in assets against more than $150 million in liabilities, the largest single creditor being the state of Rhode Island itself. Schilling later said the collapse cost him most of his personal baseball fortune, having put more than $50 million of his own money into the company. Rhode Island, accounting for interest on the guaranteed bonds, ended up on the hook for close to $100 million, a bill state taxpayers were still paying down for years afterward, eventually recovering a portion of it, around $45 million combined, through legal settlements with Schilling and other former executives more than a decade later.
What makes 38 Studios useful isn't that it's an extreme outlier. It's that nearly every mechanism in this industry shows up in it clearly, compressed into 6 years instead of spread across a slower, quieter decline. A founder's genuine passion and outside optimism secured an unusually large amount of capital before there was proof the product could work. The company scaled headcount toward an ambitious long-term project before the near-term project had proven it could fund that ambition. The burn rate on the larger bet ran independently of whether the smaller bet succeeded, and when the smaller bet came in merely solid instead of spectacular, there was no financial cushion left to absorb the gap. The visible failure was one missed loan payment in May 2012. The real failure had been built into the cost structure roughly 2 years earlier, when the studio's spending outgrew what any single game, even a well-received one, could realistically cover.
It's tempting to read a story like that and assume every collapse comes down to bad decisions by the people running the studio. Often, it doesn't. Sometimes the studio does almost everything right, and the market still moves underneath it. Publishers routinely canceled finished or nearly finished games because of a shift in corporate strategy that has nothing to do with the game's quality. A merger, a change in which platforms the company wants to prioritize, a decision to consolidate multiple studios' output into fewer, bigger releases. From the outside, a canceled game looks like a creative failure. Financially, it's frequently a portfolio decision made by people who never touched the game itself, weighing that project against everything else competing for the same limited marketing and development budget. There's also a subtler risk, platform dependency. A studio that builds its entire business around one storefront, one console generation, or one live service model is betting on decisions made by companies far larger than itself. A change in revenue share terms, a shift in what that platform's algorithm promotes, a hardware transition that makes the studio's existing tools obsolete. None of that shows up in the studio's own financial statements until the effect lands, and by then there's rarely enough runway left to adapt.
The best case outcome in this industry really does happen. A small team ships something extraordinary. It captures the cultural moment, and the studio ends up with genuine wealth and creative freedom. That story is real, which is exactly why it keeps pulling in new founders, new investors, and new state governments willing to write large checks. But the realistic successful outcome looks much smaller than that. A studio that ships solid, well-reviewed games for a decade, gradually builds savings and reputation, and never becomes a headline either way. The realistic negative outcome is a studio that makes something genuinely good, sells a respectable number of copies, and still can't cover a cost structure built during more optimistic times. And the outright failure scenario is the one where ambition outran the studio's ability to fund it, where the size of the bet grew faster than the evidence that the bet would pay off. Go back to the assumption you probably started with, that owning a game studio is a creative business where quality determines the outcome. It isn't, not primarily. It's a business defined by the length and size of the gap between when the spending starts and when the market finally tells you whether it was worth it. Great games get made inside that gap all the time, but the gap is what decides whether the studio that made them is still around to make the next one. That's the real economics of owning a gaming studio, not selling entertainment, but surviving the years of uncertainty that come before anyone finds out if the entertainment was any good.